Donna Hardy. I'm a physical therapist with the VNA of Cape Cod, and I'm here to present Concussions and Sports for the Falmouth Health Department. Okay. Before I start, I'd like to get an idea of why people have come in the audience to better understand what I could help them with covering today on concussion. Are you a parent?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Do you have kids in sports?
Yes.
Yes, okay, okay. Have any of your kids have had concussions?
Yes.
Okay, all right, good. So if you ever want to add anything into what I'm saying, that would be great, because I've only had one kid with a concussion and it didn't last very long, okay?
That's my experience.
Okay, okay. And they say, there's a saying before I start that if you've seen one concussion, you've seen one concussion. They're all different. They all affect people differently. They say if someone is hit with the same amount of force in the same area in the head, they'll come out with two totally different scenarios of what they present with. So concussion can be very different. It has a lot of similarities, but it can be different in everyone. So don't compare. Don't compare yourself or your kids to anyone else. Okay, so you have your outline, and in the outline, I'll go over exactly what's in it now. Number one is the goal of this presentation. I will go over that, and it's basically to be smart and not scared. Okay. Number two is what is concussion? I'm going to go over functional versus structural injury. Number three is who does concussion affect? And I'll give some statistics on that. Number four, how is it diagnosed? Some signs and symptoms. Number five, what to do if you suspect a concussion, including medical treatment, recovery, and return to play. Number six, I'm going to talk about managing concussion through education. I'm going to talk about the law, what we need to teach our kids, and how to play and practice smart. And finally, number seven is where to get more information. The organizations that I got a lot of information were from the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. They have a program called the Heads Up program. Anybody could get free information, brochures off of that website. There's the Mass Brain Injury Association, and it's the BIA Mass, and anyone could get any free information off of that. Okay. There's a good book out. It's called Concussions and Our Kids. It's been written by Dr. Robert Cantu, C-A-N-T-U. He's a neurosurgery professor and co-director of the Center for Traumatic Encephalopathy at Boston University School of Medicine. And he's a senior advisor to the NFL for head, neck, and spine problems. I heard Dr. Robert Cantu talk about 6 years ago. Every year, Boston University Medical School puts on a program for concussion with all the latest research being done. Okay. And there's an article, a very good article called How to Talk to Your Kids About Concussion Without Scaring Them. And I have the article up here if you want to take the notes. It's written by Sheila Mulrooney Eldred, and it's published in Good Sports. Okay. There are multiple YouTube and TED Talks on concussion. You just Google concussion and you're just swamped with information. Okay. So hopefully I could just put a little of this information into perspective for you and have some questions answered. Okay. My background, I'm a physical therapist. I've been a physical therapist for 35 years, most of which I've been working with adults. Okay. I don't work with kids who've had concussion. I personally have experienced having kids who have had a concussion and who have played football throughout their high school and college career. And I do work with adults who have had concussions, mainly from falls and hitting their heads. Okay. So I've been to several courses on concussion, and I've read countless articles, and hopefully I've read some very recent information too, which will shed a little different light on things. And finally, I will have a video. It's a TED Talk, and it's a a researcher at Stanford University. It's some interesting new stuff coming out. Okay. Next, I'm just going to ask, has anyone in this room had a concussion? Has anyone known anybody who's had a concussion? Okay. Okay. And you said your concussion was resolved pretty fast? Okay. All right. I'll ask you some more questions as we go along. Okay. I have a couple true-false questions before we start. The first one is, if your child has had a concussion, it's important to keep them awake for 24 hours to observe the signs and the symptoms. Is that true or false? You're right, it's false. You do not have to keep kids awake, and you don't have to wake them up every hour to see how, this is your prize, it's a brain. It's a squishy brain. And you don't have to wake them up every hour to make sure they're okay. Concussions need rest, and sleep is important for healing. Okay. And another question. Sports is the leading cause of concussion among kids 15 to 24 years old. True or false? What do you say? It's actually false. Motor vehicle accidents are the #1 cause of concussion in that age group. Okay, so nobody gets a brain. You want a brain? Okay, so those are just a couple little questions. So to get started, I'm going to go over the goal of this presentation. Again, I want you to be smart about it and not scared about it. Okay, we need to remember the importance of balance in our lives. We must focus on educating ourselves and our kids. We need to stress safety and health, and it's important, and the importance of participating in sports. I think things have swung way too far to the other side where people are just so afraid to let their kids participate in sports. And I just read a recent article saying that obesity is becoming a big problem in the US among kids. So we really need to get them out and active and not sitting in front of their screens. Okay. A researcher just wrote, we don't want to over-dramatize concussion. We don't want people reducing their activity, their physical activity, for fear of it. And a recent Harris poll in 2015 found that 1 in 4 parents forbid their children to play contact sports now. Okay. So hopefully after this, you'll learn a little bit more and you won't be as afraid. You'll know what to do and you'll know that there is hope. Okay. So the next question is, what is concussion? Okay. Concussion is a mild brain injury induced by biomechanical forces. Quick question, do you have to have a bump on the head to get a concussion? No. It could also come from a jolt to the body that could cause a whiplash injury. Okay. So a lot of people, I know I had a horrible whiplash injury when I was a student. I was rear-ended on the highway, and never once had anyone checked my head out. They just gave me a collar in the hospital, and being an obstinate teenager, I threw it out in the garbage can outside the hospital. So way back when, people didn't realize you could get concussions from a whiplash injury. Okay. So they describe it as a functional injury rather than a structural injury. So what does that mean? It's basically a disturbance in the brain function rather than like an area on the brain that you could see a bruise. Okay. It causes chemical changes. It's microscopic tearing of nerve fibers, axons, that release chemicals, toxic chemicals. Okay, the chemicals really disturb the function of the brain, how the brain processes information. Okay. No abnormality is seen on a standard test like a CAT scan or MRI. Those tests are usually done if the doctor wants to rule out a more serious injury like a fracture or a bleed. Okay. When they say concussion is a mild brain injury, mild can be very misleading. Concussions are serious, especially for the developing brain. They could have long-lasting effects if not managed properly. Okay. Concussions may or may not involve loss of consciousness. Okay. It's expected that most people will spontaneously recover from a concussion. 80 to 90% of concussions will resolve within 7 to 10 days. Okay, so that's a lot, you know. So that's something you don't need to be scared about. And you could tell your kids that they don't need to be scared about it either. You know, if they have one, it's important that they let you know that they're having something going on, but they don't have to be afraid that it's going to go on forever. Okay. Only 1.5% experience symptoms greater than 1 month. Okay, so that's not a lot. And if we manage it properly, we could reduce the amount of time it takes to recover from it. Any questions? Okay. So the next question is, who does it affect? Some statistics. Okay. Concussions affect kids, athletes of all ages, veterans, the elderly, car accident victims, bike riders, anyone moving. Okay. Everyone. And some statistics. In the US, approximately 300,000 sports-related concussions occur annually. Among 15 to 24-year-olds, sports are second only to motor vehicle accidents as a leading cause of concussion. Girls are almost twice as likely to suffer a concussion as boys are in similar sports. This was done from a high school study published in the American Journal of Sports Medicine. There's an increased risk for long-term effects of kids who take repeated blows to the head before the age of 12. Okay. It's that developing brain that is so important. Okay. And this was done at a study at Boston University Medical School. Injury rates are higher during competition versus practice, which makes sense. Concussions occur across a wide variety of sports. The majority of concussions happen in football. Next is girls soccer. Next is boys wrestling. And after that, it's girls basketball. Okay. And that was surprising to me to see boys wrestling. Would never have thought of that. Okay. Any questions? All right, now we'll kind of get into the meat of stuff. How is concussion diagnosed? Okay, again, you can't put the brain under a regular CAT scan or MRI to see anything. Nothing will show up. Okay, we have to look at signs and symptoms. All right, what's the difference between a sign and a symptom? Okay, signs are what we actually observe happening with the person who is concussed. Symptoms are what is reported by the concussed person, what they're complaining of, what they're feeling. Okay. So some common signs include, this is something that we could see. Okay. We could see that the child can't recall recent events, like what happened just prior to and just after the concussion. We ask them a question about it, they won't remember it. They appear to us as dazed, confused, stunned. Okay. They forget instructions or assignments or their position on the field. Okay. They're unsure of the game score. They're unsure of who the opponent is. They move clumsily. They answer questions slowly, delayed response times. They lose consciousness even just briefly. Okay. And they could show mood, behavior, and personality changes. Okay. This reminds me of right after I took that course given by the Boston University Medical Center. The course was Thursday and a Friday, and I went to my son's high school football game Friday night. And it was like I was just reliving everything I learned in the course. 2 kids just right in front of me. I heard the helmets clanking, and one kid did not get up quite as fast as the other one. And I knew at that moment that after everything I learned, that he had a concussion. He got up really slowly. He did look dazed and confused. He walked back to the sideline. I saw the trainer working with him a little bit. Now, this was way back when. Brian was a freshman in high school, and I don't even remember the year, but it was just when all this was beginning. And I heard somebody in the stands yell, "Hey, put him back in, he just got his bell rung." I mean, that was an old famous saying. And everybody just thought, get him back in, he's okay, just hit his head. And that was one of the things I learned in that course is we can't have parents saying those things. There's a lot of pressure, there used to be a lot of pressure on coaches by the parents to get their kids back in the game. So we sat out for one play, and then they sent him back in, and all I could say was, oh dear God. Put him back in, one play happened, and he basically didn't do anything. I was watching him, and he was just standing in the field, and he didn't know what to do. And right after that, one of the coaches, thank God, got him out. So that's a symptom. They looked dazed and confused. He didn't know what he was supposed to do. Okay. When I did go to this course in BU, there was a speaker there his name was Don Hasselback. Does anybody know of who he is? He used to play for the Patriots. I believe one of his sons was the quarterback for another NFL team. Anyway, he was speaking because he had initial signs of that chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And he said when he was playing a game in college, he was hit extremely hard. He was on the ground. He did pass out briefly, came to. It took him, he said, 5 minutes to get up to standing. And he ended up walking back to the sideline, sitting on the bench. And then he realized he was on the opposite team's bench. He wasn't even on his side of the field. And he knew he had a concussion. Did he finish the game? Yep. So, but that was a long time ago. So we know a little bit more about that now, that we don't let the kids back to play if anything like that happens. Okay, we're just going over the signs and symptoms of concussion. Signs are what we can see, what we could observe. Symptoms are what they feel. Okay, so some of the symptoms include, and these symptoms may or may not appear right away. They include headache or pressure in the head, nausea, vomiting, balance problems and dizziness, double or blurred vision. Sometimes kids complain about getting really tired when they read. Sometimes they complain about the words like they're jumping around, they're just not still, they're having a hard time focusing. They have sensitivity to light and noise. They feel sluggish, groggy, hazy, foggy, fuzzy, any of those words they might throw out at you. They're confused. They have concentration problems, memory problems, and a lot of times they say to you they just aren't feeling right. Okay. And imagine a little kid who doesn't have that vocabulary or that ability to express how they feel. They really can't tell you. So you really have to notice the signs more and how they're behaving. Okay. And sometimes they have motion sensitivity. A lot of these symptoms have to do with vision. And vision is almost always affected when someone has a concussion. So I thought, well, I'm going to get everybody standing up for a little bit, and we'll show you how vision can affect your balance. Okay? I'm tired of just talking to you. I want you guys to do a little bit. So everybody stand up, if you don't mind. You were here just going to relax, weren't you? Okay, hands out of your pockets. Okay, and this is what they actually will test the kids on the sidelines. They will do vision and balance testing. Okay, what I'm going to have you do for safety's sake is just hold on to the chair. Okay, I'm going to put you in a position where you have to really challenge yourself and balance. So I'm going to have you stand as if you're standing on a tightrope. Okay, now can everybody just stare straight ahead, don't move your eyes. Okay, and then let go. Can everybody balance? No. Put your feet together then and try it. Okay. Okay, is everybody balanced okay? Okay, so now what I want you to do is keep your head still, but just move your eyes from side to side, like that. Okay, do you feel a difference? Are you swaying a little bit more? Okay, now what I want you to do is close your eyes altogether. Okay, feel a difference? Okay, all right. So our vision really helps us coordinate and do a lot of things, including balance. Okay, so when someone has a concussion, it's bound to affect their vision in some way or another, so it will affect their balance. So I just wanted to kind of give you guys a little idea of what of how it can affect balance. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? Like when your son or daughter had a concussion, did they have any of these symptoms? Did they complain of any of those? Okay. Okay, most of them. Okay. And, okay, I'm going to go on, and then I'll ask you more about how they handle the treatment. Okay. All right. So, did you guys get an outline? They're on the table in the back, and basically I'm going down the outline. We already went over the goal of the presentation, which is to be smart and not scared. We went over what is a concussion, who does it affect, some statistics, and how it's diagnosed. So basically it's diagnosed by the signs and the symptoms. It does not show anything on your typical CAT scan or MRI. If the doctor does order a CAT scan or MRI, it's usually because they want to rule out something more serious. Okay. So what do you do if you suspect a concussion? Okay. And basically this is how we manage concussions. Okay. First of all, it's really important that you go to the emergency room if someone has any of these signs or symptoms: loss of consciousness, severe headache or worsening headache, blurred vision, trouble walking, confusion, saying nonsensical things, slurred speech, and inability to wake your child. Okay. And again, you do not need to keep your child awake for 24 hours. Okay. You always want to call the doctor, get some advice, or go to the urgency center, especially if there's vomiting, dizziness, headaches, trouble concentrating. And then they will direct you and give you the advice on what to do. For milder symptoms, the doctor will recommend rest, okay, and watch for changes because symptoms can develop hours down the road, okay. Watch for a worsening headache, okay. And basically, I'd like to tell everybody, when in doubt, check it out, okay. No harm in going to the urgency center and having it checked out, okay. I have a quick story to tell. I have a friend whose son was riding his bicycle on a stone wall that had a nice flat. And of course, he didn't have a helmet on. Not that, well. And he fell off his bike and hit his head. Went to go watch the football game. Mom picked him up later after the football game, was driving home. And he told her about the fall. And she was, I wonder if we should go to the emergency room. She's driving home, and then something just wasn't right. And she said, you know what, let's go get you checked out. He actually didn't have a concussion. He actually had a bleed in his brain. When they put him in the CAT scan and had him down flat, that's when it showed up. He was having intense headaches, and he ended up having to have emergency surgery. So basically, if you doubt anything at all, go get it checked out, okay? If he had a helmet on, it might have prevented that, but he probably would have had a concussion as well. All right, so the recovery process. Okay. Oh, did I go over what to do if you, yes, medical treatment, okay. And then the recovery process, what does that involve, okay? What I had mentioned before is most kids will recover within 7 to 10 days spontaneously with rest, okay? What does rest mean? It means both physical and cognitive mental rest. So they need to avoid screens. They need to avoid video games. They need to avoid a lot of intense reading. They really just need to calm everything down. They need to avoid any kind of rough physical activity. Okay. Recent research has shown that if someone is recovering from a concussion and they're having a longer time to recover, that actual aerobic exercise is good for them as long as it's moderated by a professional. Okay. Because any kind of aerobic exercise is good for our body. It brings more oxygen to all the areas that need. Okay. All right, so recovery involves rest. Commonly, kids miss up to 1 week of school. There's gradual return to a full workload. It's always important just to be in good communication with the teacher. Sometimes kids need a little bit of extra help and they get tutors. My older son tutored a player from Nauset, a football player from Nauset, who was having difficulty with math. And after a couple months, he caught up and was doing okay. When should they return to play? Okay. There's a bunch of different criteria, and the things they look at is, number one, they have to have medical clearance by a professional who's been trained in concussion. Okay. And that's the law now. Okay. And it's also the opinion of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, and the CDC. Okay. So to talk about it a little bit more, what is rest? Okay, we already said no video games. So they've been resting around for a couple of days, not a lot of TV, not a lot of loud music. You just don't want to overstimulate that brain. And then they're feeling good, they're not having any more symptoms, so you just want to increase their activity gradually. Okay? If they start having the symptoms come on, you have to back off. Okay? I went to a course just in April on a therapist who works at NYU. She's an occupational therapist, and she said one of her clients was a college student who had a concussion, and she was doing better, and so this therapist recommended she start going out a little bit more into the community. She said, why don't you go have a cup of coffee with your friends, take it easy. So instead, this girl who was in college ended up going out at night to a club, you know, loud music, dancing, and boom, everything came back, all the symptoms came back. So it's got to be a graded step-by-step process. All right. So we need that medical clearance, no more symptoms, okay? And to return to play, it's really important that they go through testing, okay? So even before they have the concussion, they should go through pre-testing, okay? What you want to test is balance, vision, cognition, and all the processing of information, and there are certain tests out there that they do. I'm not sure what Falmouth does, but some teams, my son's football team in college, did testing when they were freshmen. So they had a baseline. So in order for them to return to play, they needed to get to the baseline, or pretty close to it. Symptom-free medical clearance, okay? So I'm not sure what they do in the school systems here. If the symptoms are prolonged, usually greater than 1 month to 2 months, there's really no set timeline. They call it post-concussion syndrome. And not many, percentage-wise, kids get this, but when they do, it's really important that if you see these symptoms prolonged, and if you see them not being able to tolerate increased activity, that you get them to see some specialists. Dr. Judelson from Spalding heads up a team, their sports concussion clinic, and there's the flyer back there, okay? And there's a team of occupational therapists and physical therapists who have been concentrating, working on this all along. So we really have a good source right here on the Cape. So if your kids are experiencing the symptoms longer than 2 weeks, 4 weeks, and you feel like things still aren't right, and they're still not getting back to their regular schedule, it's probably a good idea to get a referral to this clinic, okay? All right, and you want to consider tutors as well. And you also really need to be aware of the mental health issues. Dr. Jared Spencer, a sports psychologist, says, keep the mental health of your athlete front and center. If you shut down a high school athlete who's used to working out intensely every day, they won't feel so good. Those endorphins won't be there. Also, they're used to being with their buddies, you know, for 3 hours every day. You know, Brian said it was a brotherhood. Those kids were his brothers. You know, they went through a lot together. If they don't have that, they're definitely going to get down. You know, so you got to look out for anxiety and depression. Okay. Sometimes if the kids are feeling well enough and they're able to tolerate it, let them go watch a practice. You know, those are some of the things you could do as they're getting better, just so they don't feel so left out. Okay. So on to the next subject, which is managing concussion through education. Okay. It's important that everybody knows the law and tries to make sure that the law is being, what's the word I'm looking for? The law is being obeyed. Okay. All 50 states now have concussion laws. The Massachusetts law for youth sports concussion went into effect in 2010, signed by Governor Deval Patrick. Okay. Some of the key provisions of the law stated that there has to be documented education annually for coaches and trainers. So every year they need to have education on concussion. Okay. There needs to be mandatory signed medical history forms for every kid playing a sport. There is no return to sports without medical clearance. Okay. No encouragement of dangerous play. Okay. If you notice a coach, you know, coaching the wrong way or telling them to do the wrong things, I'm not an expert in football, so I can't even tell you what it is, but you might want to bring that up. Okay. Mandatory record keeping on concussions. Okay. There was an article published in the Boston Globe. I have it up here. It's, "Are we still taking concussions seriously?" There were studies done, and it showed that there were some school systems in Massachusetts who still aren't complying with these laws completely. Okay. So, you know, if you want to be a really involved parent, find out what your school system's doing. Okay. If anybody wants to get this title, you can Google it and you'll have the article for yourself. Okay. Another part of managing concussion through education is teaching your kids. Okay, it's really important not to scare them, but to teach them. Let them feel comfortable. They know if they do get a concussion, it's okay, it's treatable, but you have to do it the right way. Okay. It's imperative that our kids know the signs and symptoms of concussion. The number one reason kids gave for playing with a concussion and with concussion symptoms were they didn't know the risks and they weren't aware of the symptoms. This is how they responded. In an article from the Boston Globe, a survey done with more than 6,000 public school students in Massachusetts, 50% of those student athletes who had symptoms kept playing. Now that is not smart, okay? 16% said that they stopped playing, but they didn't get any medical attention. And the remaining 34% stopped playing and got medical attention. So we really need to up those numbers, okay? Kids need to know about it. You don't want to scare them, but they just need to know about it and know that it's treatable, okay? Dr. Cantu, who I mentioned earlier, he's a neurosurgery professor at BU. He says it's like playing with fire to keep playing with a concussion. Okay. The two main risks of playing through head injury are, number one, second impact syndrome. Has anybody heard of that? Okay. Second impact syndrome is rare, but it can be fatal. So basically what that is someone has a concussion, they go back in and play. Before that concussion is resolved, they get another concussion again. With all the chemical processes going on, it could cause someone to die. It's rare, but it has happened, okay? You don't want to scare the kids about that. You want to tell them it's very rare, but that's, even if they suspect they're not feeling right after they've been hit hard, they need to sit it out, okay? And then the second, more common risk of playing through head injury is an additional hit before recovering can exponentially lengthen the time it takes to recover and overcome the symptoms, okay? So it's better to rest 1 or 2 games than to miss a whole season or to miss your entire career, okay? And the next facet of managing concussion through education is playing and practicing smarter. Excuse me. You want to use the correct techniques in whatever sport that you're playing, okay? Having hit-free practices. Back when Brian started playing in high school, all his practices were hitting. I mean, even when he was a little midget, whatever they were, midgets and mites, and they were all hitting. You know, back then they didn't know any better. Even when he started college football 4 years ago, they were hitting every practice, and by his senior year, they were only hitting 1 or 2 practices. Okay. You really need to know that more equipment doesn't mean you're safer. Okay. I have a good video on helmets and how safe they really are in terms of concussion, and they're not. A lot of times you see these poor little kids with these huge helmets on their heads, and they could barely hold their heads up. I mean, they're going to have a severe whiplash injury because their necks aren't strong enough to hold that head. Okay. Recommendations by Dr. Cantu. He recommends that flag football should be played up until the age of 14 because that developing brain is so vulnerable. And he recommends no heading in soccer before the age of 14. And there's other recommendations he makes. Okay. So, you know, already I've seen the sport of football change over the last 10 years, and I think we're going to see it change a lot more in the next 10 years. And another part of education and concussion management is being prepared. And that basically means get those baseline tests done of your kids. Okay. Dr. Cantu recommends a specific test for vision. It's called King-Devic. I have an example of that there. Balance tests, it's a BESS test. And one for symptoms and cognition, it's called the SCAT test, SCATT. The trainers or your concussion team should be doing those, okay? Those should be done before they start playing, and you can certainly do it every year before they start playing. In college, Brian had it just done in his freshman year because their brains aren't changing as much as they get older. As they're younger, they should have them done every year. Okay. So does anybody have any questions? Yeah. You want to come up into the microphone? I know.
If your child has already had a concussion and is healed from it and goes back to sports and gets a second concussion or a third concussion, should you be more concerned with repeated concussions?
Yes, you should be more concerned. But if they're fully healed from the first concussion, it's not going to have that exponential effect that it would if they weren't healed from it. A lot of doctors will say, you know, if they've had 1, 2, 3, you might want to start thinking about another sport. And everybody's different.
And it's not always from I mean, you know, the first one may have been from a sport, the second one from an automobile accident,
right.
The third one from a sport.
Right. And I've known many kids, some of Brian's friends, who have had to stop playing football because of a second one, which was so much worse than the first one, you know. So, yeah. Basically, you have to, you know, go by what your doctor says, what the team says, the team of concussion therapists, and again, your own gut. You know, it's better to sit it out. It really is. It's hard for kids, though. I can't imagine having to tell my son to do that. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. This video is, it's a TED Talk, and it's a researcher from Stanford University who actually played football for Stanford. So let me get it started. Do we need to lower the lights or?
The word concussion evokes a fear these days more so than it ever has. And I know this personally. I played 10 years of football, was struck on the head thousands of times. And I have to tell you though, what was much worse than that was a pair of bike accidents I had where I suffered concussions, and I'm still dealing with the effects of the most recent one today as I stand in front of you. There is a fear around concussion that does have some evidence behind it. There is information that a repeated history of concussion can lead to early dementias such as Alzheimer's and chronic traumatic encephalopathy. That was the subject of the Will Smith movie, Concussion. And so everybody is caught up in football and what they see in the military, but you may not know that bike riding is the leading cause of concussion for kids, sports-related concussion, that is. And so another thing that I should tell you that you may not know is that the helmets that are worn in bicycling and football and many activities, they're not designed or tested for how well they can protect your children against concussion. And they're in fact designed and tested for their ability to protect against skull fracture. And so I get this question all the time from parents, and they ask me, would you let your own child play football, or should I let my child play soccer? And I think that as a field, we're a long way from giving an answer with any kind of confidence there. So I look at that question from a bit of a different lens, and I want to know, how can we prevent concussion? Is that even possible? And most experts think that it's not. But the work that we're doing in my lab is starting to reveal more of the details around concussion so that we can have a better understanding. The reason we're able to prevent skull fracture with helmets is because it's pretty simple. We know how it works. Concussion's been much more of a mystery. So to give you a sense of what might be happening in concussion, I want to show you the video here that you see when you type in to Google, what is a concussion? The CDC website comes up, and this video essentially tells the whole story. What you see is the head moves forward, the brain lags behind, then the brain catches up and smashes into the skull. It rebounds off the skull and then proceeds to run into the other side of the skull. And what you'll notice is highlighted in this video from the CDC, which I'll note was funded by the NFL, is that the outer surfaces of the brain where it was to have smashed into the skull looks like it's been damaged or injured. So it's on the outer surface of the brain. And what I'd like to do with this video is to tell you that there are some aspects that are probably right, indicative of what the scientists think happens in concussion, but there's probably more that's wrong with this video. So one thing I do agree with, and I think most experts would, is that the brain does have this dynamics. It does lag behind the skull and then catch up and move back and forth and oscillate. That we think is true. However, the amount of motion you see in the brain in this video is probably not right at all. There's very little room in the cranial vault, only a few millimeters, and it's filled entirely with cerebral spinal fluid, which acts as a protective layer. And so the brain as a whole probably moves very little inside the skull. The other problem with this video is that the brain is shown as a kind of rigid whole as it moves around, and that's not true either. Your brain is one of the softest substances in your body, and you can think of it kind of like Jell-O. So as your head is moving back and forth, your brain is twisting and turning and contorting, and the tissue is getting stretched. And so most experts, I think, would agree that concussion is not likely to be something that's happening on this outer surface of the brain, but rather it's something that's much deeper towards the center of the brain. Now, the way that we're approaching this problem to try to understand the mechanism of concussion and to figure out if we can prevent it is we are using a device like this. It's a mouth guard. It has sensors in it that are essentially the same that are in your cell phone, accelerometers, gyroscopes, and when someone is struck in the head, it can tell you how their head moved at 1,000 samples per second. The principle behind the mouth guard is this. It fits onto your teeth. Your teeth are one of the hardest substances in your body, so it rigidly couples to your skull and gives you the most precise possible measurement of how the skull moves. People have tried other approaches with helmets. We've looked at other sensors that go on your skin, and they all simply move around too much. And so we found that this is the only reliable way to take a good measurement. So now that we've got this device, we can go beyond studying cadavers, because you can only learn so much about concussion from studying a cadaver. And we want to learn and study live humans. So where can we find a group of willing volunteers to go out and smash their heads into each other on a regular basis and sustain concussion? Well, I was one of them. And it's your local friendly Stanford football team. So this is our laboratory. And I want to show you the first concussion that we measured with this device. One of the things that I should point out is the device has this gyroscope in it, and that allows you to measure the rotation of the head. Most experts think that that's the critical factor that might start to tell us what is happening in concussion. So please watch this video.
Burgers bring extra people late, but Luck has time. Lucy is crushed. I hope that he's all right. Top of your screen, you'll see him come on just this little poster out, get separation, safety. And here it comes at you at real speed. You'll hear this. A hit delivered by Case.
Sorry, 3 times is probably a little excessive there, but you get the idea. So when you look at just the film here, pretty much the only thing you can see is he got hit really hard and he was hurt. But when we extract the data out of the mouth guard that he was wearing, we can see much more detail, much richer information. And one of the things that we noticed here is that he was struck in the lower left side of his face mask. And so that did something first that was a little counterintuitive. His head did not move to the right. In fact, it rotated first to the left. Then as the neck began to compress, the force of the blow caused it to whip back to the right. So this left-right motion was sort of a whiplash type phenomenon, and then we think that is probably what led to the brain injury. Now this device is only limited in such that it can measure the skull motion, but what we really want to know is what's happening inside of the brain. So we collaborate with Svein Kleiven's group in Sweden. They've developed a finite element model of the brain. And so this is a simulation using the data from our mouth guard from the injury I just showed you. And what you see is the brain. This is a cross-section right in the front of the brain twisting and contorting, as I mentioned. So you can see this doesn't look a lot like the CDC video. Now the colors that you're looking at are how much the brain tissue is being stretched. And so the red is 50%. That means the brain has been stretched to 50% its original length, the tissue in that particular area. And the main thing I want to draw your attention to is this red spot. So the red spot is very close to the center of the brain, and relatively speaking, you don't see a lot of colors like that on the exterior surface as the CDC video showed. Now to explain a little more detail about how we think concussion it might be happening, one thing I should mention is that we and others have observed that a concussion is more likely when you're struck and your head rotates in this direction. This is more common in sports like football, but this seems to be more dangerous. So what might be happening there? Well, one thing that you'll notice in the human brain that is different than other animals is we have these 2 very large lobes. We have the right brain and the left brain. And the key thing to notice in this figure here is that right down the center of the right brain and the left brain, there's a large fissure that goes deep into the brain. And in that fissure, which you can't see in this image, you'll have to trust me, there is a fibrous sheet of tissue. It's called the falx, and it runs from the front of your head all the way to the back of your head. And it's quite stiff. And so what that allows for is when you're struck and your head rotates in this left-right direction, forces can rapidly transmit right down to the center of your brain. Now what's there at the bottom of this fissure? It's the wiring of your brain. And in fact, this red bundle here at the bottom of that fissure is the single largest fiber bundle that is the wiring that connects the right and left sides of your brain. It's called the corpus callosum. And we think that this might be one of the most common mechanisms of concussion, and that as the forces move down, they strike the corpus callosum, it causes a dissociation between your right and your left brain and could explain some of the symptoms of concussion. This finding is also consistent of what we've seen in this brain disease that I mentioned, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So this is an image of a middle-aged ex-professional football player. And the thing that I want to point out is if you look at the corpus callosum, and I'll page back here so you can see the size of normal corpus callosum and the size of the person here who has chronic traumatic encephalopathy, it is greatly atrophied. And the same goes for all of the space in the ventricles. These ventricles are much larger. And so all of this tissue near the center of the brain has died off over time. So what we're learning is indeed consistent. Now, there is some good news here, and I hope to give you a sense of hope by the end of this talk, that one of the things that we've noticed, specifically about this mechanism of injury, is although there's a rapid transmission of the forces down this fissure, it still takes a defined amount of time. And what we think is that if we can slow the head down just enough so that the brain does not lag behind the skull, but instead it moves in synchrony with the skull, then we might be able to prevent this mechanism of concussion. So how can we slow the head down? A gigantic helmet. So with more space, you have more time, and this is a bit of a joke, but some of you may have seen this. This is bubble soccer, and it's a real sport. In fact, I saw some young adults playing this sport down the street from my house the other day, and as far as I know, there have been no reported concussions. But in all seriousness, this principle does work, but this has gone too far. This isn't something that's practical for bike riding or playing football. And so we are collaborating with a company in Sweden called Hovding. Some of you may have seen their work. And they're using the same principle of air to give you some extra space to prevent concussion. Kids, don't try this at home, please. This stuntman does not have a helmet. He instead has a neck collar. And this neck collar has sensors in it, the same type of sensors anyway, that are in our mouth guard. And it detects when he's likely to have a fall, and there's an airbag that explodes and triggers the same way that an airbag works in your car, essentially. And in the experiments that we've done in my lab with their device, we found that it can greatly reduce the risk of concussion in some scenarios compared to a normal bicycle helmet. So it's a pretty exciting development. But in order for us to actually realize the benefits of technology that can prevent concussion, it needs to meet regulations. That's a reality. And this device is for sale in Europe, but is not for sale in the US, and probably won't be anytime soon. So I wanted to tell you why. There's some good reasons, and then there are some not so good reasons. Bike helmets are federally regulated. The Consumer Product Safety Commission has been given jurisdiction to approve any bike helmet for sale. And this is the test they use. This is back to what I was telling you in the beginning of the talk about skull fracture. That's what this test is for. And that's an important thing to do. It can save your life, but it's not sufficient, I would say. So for example, one thing this test doesn't evaluate is it doesn't tell you, is that airbag gonna trigger at the right time and place and not trigger when it doesn't need to. Similarly, it's not gonna tell you, is this helmet likely to prevent concussion or not? And if you look at football helmets, which aren't regulated, they still have a very similar test. They're not regulated by the government anyway. They have an industry body, which is the way most industries work. But this industry body, I can tell you, has been quite resistant to updating their standards. So in my lab, we are working on not only the mechanism of concussion, but we want to understand how can we have better test standards. And we hope that the governments can use this type of information to encourage innovation by letting consumers know how protected are you with a given helmet. And I want to bring this back finally to the original question I asked, which is, would I feel comfortable letting my child play football or ride a bicycle? And this might be just a result of my own traumatic experience. I'm much more nervous about my daughter Rose riding a bicycle. So she's a year and a half old, and she's already, well, wants to anyway, race down the streets of San Francisco. This is at the bottom of one of these streets. And so my personal goal is to, and I believe this is possible, is to further develop these technologies. And in fact, we're working on something in my lab in particular that really makes optimal use of the given space of a helmet. And I am confident that we will be able to, before she's ready to ride a two-wheeler, have something available that can, in fact, really reduce the risk of concussion and comply with regulatory bodies. And so what I'd like to do, and I know that this is, for some of you, it's more immediate nature, I've got a couple years here, is to be able to tell parents and grandparents when I'm asked, it is safe and healthy for your children to engage in these activities. And I'm very fortunate to have a wonderful team at Stanford that's working hard on this. So I hope to come back in a few years with the final story, but for now, I will tell you that please don't just be afraid when you hear the word concussion. There is hope. Thank you.
Cool. Cool stuff. Any questions? Any comments? If you want to go home and go to bed. Feel free to come up and look at the articles here and write down the, this one is really good, how to talk to kids about concussion without scaring them. Really good. Okay. Thank you.